Hello everyone, we are finally in for the video for this last video for the month of September. I was not able to get to it earlier in the week due to other things that had happened, but we finally got the chance today to come in and do it. So as always, at the end of the months, typically we do the next video in our Presidents series by going over all the presidents is what we're working on. And last month was William McKinley, who was our 25th president, was also from Ohio, and McKinley ended up being assassinated shortly after beginning his second term of office in September of 1901 is when he got killed. His successor is possibly one of the best-known presidents in American history. It is one of the four on Mount Rushmore and the most recent of the ones at Mount Rushmore, and that was Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, as many people call him. So today we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a short look over the life of Teddy Roosevelt, of Theodore, whichever one you might prefer. I'll probably alternate myself here every once in a while. And he is going to be our 26th president from 1901, when he takes office upon the death of President William McKinley, until 1909, after actually winning his own term. It was 4 years long. So to begin, as always, we go back to kind of cover their whole life here. We cover a little bit with the beginnings, with before they were president, how they got there, and of course we go into the presidency, and then whatever happened after they left office, if anything significant occurred during those years. So for Theodore Roosevelt, he was born on October 27th of 1858 in New York City. His parents were Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who was a wealthy businessman in New York, and Martha Bullock Roosevelt, who was his wife. He had an older sister named Anna, and a younger brother named Elliot, and another sister who was younger him in this case, and that was Corinne. As a boy, Teddy, or Teddy, as the family often called Theodore, was often a very frail child. He was not a very healthy child. He constantly got sick, constantly, had medical problems that put him into the frail state. He was not a very healthful child. And one of the problems was Roosevelt, as a youngster, suffered traumatically from asthma attacks. He had asthma, and when he was younger, it debilitated him so much that both of his parents, honestly feared whether or not he would survive. Of course, back in the day, doctors were not as far along as they are now in terms of medical science and medical knowledge, and thus there was really no cure or any kind of help or medicine that the doctors could give him to try to help him cope better with his asthma. And at one point, Roosevelt did recall later in his life, his father had once told him that, Theodore, you are strong in your mind, but your body is weak. And basically telling him, you have a strong mental acuity. You have the brains, but you have a very frail body. And I think that come from his father and his mother's devotion, that they wanted their child to grow up and become something, but at the same time they were warning him, don't know your limits. Do not over-exasperate yourself. And I think that might have been what his father was trying to get to him at that point. Roosevelt, during his childhood years, would develop an interest in zoology, which would follow him throughout the rest of his life and have a heavy impact on his later efforts on conservation during his time in the White House. And this fascination with zoology for Roosevelt would begin as young as age 7, when he ended up seeing a dead seal in the New York market. The family bought the dead seal, and then Roosevelt was able to obtain the seal's head and then formed a small makeshift taxidermy museum with a bunch of his cousins that displayed the head of this dead seal. And Roosevelt quickly gained an interest into natural animals and stuff like that. He got really interested. He got interested in taxidermy, zoology, looking up books about different species and stuff like that. Roosevelt was heavily into this, and this would influence his views on nature and conservation during his latter years. The Roosevelt family, however, was a wealthy family in New York. They were by no means poor, unlike several other presidents who had come before him, and Roosevelt was quite well set up by his family. And during the late 1860s, so after the Civil War, the Roosevelt family decided to take a trip, big old vacation to Europe. And while they were in Europe, they visited the Alps. And it was in the Alps that Roosevelt discovered that he loved physical exercise. He loved physical regimen, and he also discovered that doing physical exercise helped him to better cope with his asthma. It made it less severe, it minimized his asthma, and allowed him to bolster his own energy. So from this point on, in 1869, so at this point he's about 11 years old, Teddy would kind of start going on daily physical exercise routines. He would constantly be making sure that he was physically fit, doing physical activity, because he learned that that was something that really helped him cope with his asthma, and he loved it. He loved the feeling of the energy that he got from doing this. He was a very fit man for his time, not someone that was really concerned in terms of just getting old and getting fat. So this is when he began his heavy exercise routine, and he even took up boxing as something to do it, and he actually did quite well at boxing, although he, of course, had to do some training at first. He was homeschooled during his childhood, and eventually Roosevelt entered Harvard College in 1876 when he was about 18 years old. His father died 2 years later in 1878, and which Roosevelt inherited about $60,000 in 1878 money, which in 2023 would be the equivalent of almost $2 million, which pretty much set up Roosevelt for the rest of his life. He honestly probably could have gotten away with never having to hold a job or any kind of profession in his life and still been able to live out his means quite comfortably the rest of his life, just from the inheritance of the equivalent of almost $2 million today that he got upon the death of his father. After graduating from Harvard in 1880, Roosevelt met and married Alice Hathaway Lee and entered Columbia Law School. However, he would drop out after only a year in 1881 in order to enter public service in the state of New York. He would end up being elected to the New York State Assembly around age 23 and would serve in that assembly for 2 terms between 1882 and 1884. And Roosevelt, this is where he starts his political career. Now, Roosevelt kind of viewed politics as, something to achieve the people's progress. It was the people that elected their leaders and sent them to Congress. He wasn't all for the spoils system that was so prevalent at the time, but he would take, certain conditional jobs and stuff based on getting off that system at the time if it presented itself. He started his political career as an assemblyman in the New York State Assembly. Unfortunately, his political career would take a short sidestep away for a while, because when the year 1884 come up, Roosevelt had a hard-hitting tragedy that hit him right on Valentine's Day of that year. It was on Valentine's Day of 1884 that both his wife and his mother had ended up dying. His wife had just given birth to their daughter, named Alice, I think a couple days before, and then she ended up dying. And then on the very same day, on Valentine's Day of 1884, when he loses his wife, Alice, he also loses his mother. His mother passes away at the same time. And this hit Roosevelt quite hard. I can imagine it would hit anybody hard to lose both your wife and your mother on the same day, or your husband and your mother, or any combination of that matter. It would hit you pretty hard, I'm sure. And this really put Roosevelt in a depressed state. He didn't want to be in politics anymore because he was just so wallowed in grief. So he ends up deciding, you know what, I'm going to take a break from politics. I can't do this right now. I just lost my wife. I just lost my mother. I just had my newborn daughter just got born, and I was never going to know her mother, and I have to raise her on my own. And so he's kind of taking the moment to realize, I need to figure out my life right now, because I don't know if I can even go on. So what Roosevelt does is he decides that I'm going to move out away from New York. I need to get away out into the state of New York and go somewhere else to get this off my mind. And of all places, he decides to go out to the Badlands out in the Dakota Territory, which at the time, North and South Dakota are not states yet. So this is in 1884. And he decides to go out to the Dakota Territory where he's going to run a ranch while he's in the process of grieving and mourning. During his time out in the Dakota Territory, Roosevelt would hunt big game, he would drive cattle, and worked as a frontier sheriff during his time out there, and was actually quite successful at the jobs that he took up while he was out there. And we do have, right here off the bat here, we do have two pictures that we can go ahead and show. So this is a depiction of Roosevelt when he was 11 years old, about the time the family took that trip to the Alps in Europe, where he discovered that physical exercise could help him better cope with his asthma. This was him at about age 11, what he would have looked like at that time. And then here we have a picture of Roosevelt about the time that he went out to the Dakota Badlands out in about 1884, 1885. This was the outfit that he commonly wore when he went hunting at the time. And this was a picture taken of him from that time. He would have been probably about in his mid-20s by the time this photo was taken. So what ends up happening in 1886, Roosevelt decides, I think I'm over it. I think I've gotten through my grief that I needed to sort out. So he decides, I'm going back to New York. I'm going back home. So in 1886, after 2 years out in the Dakota Territory, Roosevelt decides to return home to New York. And upon reaching New York, he ends up reconciling and then marrying his longtime childhood friend, Edith Kermit Caro. And the couple would end up raising 6 children on their own, in addition to Roosevelt's older daughter, Alice, who he'd had from his first marriage. And Roosevelt, he had questions of whether or not he was getting back married too soon. His sisters kind of condemned him a little bit for rushing only after 2 years to get remarried. And as for his daughter Alice from his first marriage, she grew up pretty much only knowing her stepmother, but she also knew that that was not her mother. And Alice always had this kind of begrudging relationship with her stepmother. It wasn't like outright plain hate or hostile by any terms, but there was a begrudging uh, antagonism between these two over the years that would manifest itself time and time again. Now, with Edith, Theodore would have another 6 children, as we mentioned. These would be Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Kermit, Quentin, Ethel, which was the only daughter out of the 6, and Archibald. They would also raise Alice along with the boys and Ethel, the only other daughter in the family. And this would kind of, as we mentioned, had that very contentious relationship. There was one point where Alice, during her early years, Roosevelt wanted to send her off to a seminary school for girls, and Alice was so determined not to want to go that she blatantly told her father, "If you send me, I will do something purposely to embarrass you, to dishonor you in some manner." And Roosevelt, I think, ended up backing off from that, partly because of Alice's threat, because he knew that when she was at the school, there was not much that he could do to control her actions. In 1886, upon returning to the state of New York, Roosevelt would unsuccessfully run for mayor of New York City, which he would not get. However, he did end up getting awarded a job on the U.S. Civil Service Commission in 1889, just 3 years later, by President Benjamin Harrison for his service to the Republican Party, which was pretty much, this was a political favor. It was basically, even though the spoils system was eradicated, we're still kind of practicing in some form where the party says, okay, you've been loyal to the party during campaigns and during elections and during year in and year out. We're going to try to reward you with some kind of a higher paying job that we can legally give you. However, Roosevelt must have been pretty good at his job and within the Civil Service Commission, because despite the fact that Benjamin Harrison had given Roosevelt the job based on his loyalty to the Republican Party, his successor, Grover Cleveland, who got back in office in 1893, ended up reappointing Roosevelt to the same job and keeping him there during his second term in office, even though Cleveland himself was a Democrat and not a Republican. Roosevelt would become president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners in 1895, probably partly due to the sheriff experience that he'd had while he was out in the Dakotas. And then he was also, in 1897, he would be named Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President William McKinley, partly due to the fact that Roosevelt had a very keen interest in history, and he actually wrote a book on his study of naval warfare during the War of 1812, nearly a century before. And his scholarly work on the naval warfare during the War of 1812 was so good that it's even still looked at today by some military academies, especially in the Navy itself, for the way that it actually scholarly does the research of the tactics of the time and how everything was done and what contributed to different victories, what contributed to defeats. Roosevelt did such a good scholarly review and study of naval warfare in the War of 1812 that it really shot him into attention with even the military to some degree. And I believe this was probably a very big reason as to why McKinley ended up deciding to make him his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, because partly of the success of that scholarly historical book that he had done. And that was in 1897. A year later, when the Spanish-American War would begin in 1898, Roosevelt would end up resigning as the naval secretary. He wanted to be on the front lines. He wanted to be with the fighting men. He could not idly sit by and sit in an office chair, in his view. It was something that he wanted to go do personally and suffer through what they suffered through. And he would end up resigning his post as assistant naval secretary and then became colonel of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, which was also known by the more common nickname of the Rough Riders. And the Rough Riders are famous in American military history because they were the ones that, during the American conquest of Cuba from the Spanish during the war, Roosevelt would lead the Rough Riders in a brave but costly uphill charge that ended up winning the Battle of San Juan. They charged up the San Juan's Hill, even though it was costly, but they ended up taking the hill and thus taking San Juan as a whole. But Roosevelt and the Rough Riders are famous in U.S. military history because of that event. It was just so daring and so brave and just so kind of astonishing that they managed to accomplish a victory that it kind of put them down in the annals of great military feats of American soldiers. And that is probably the one event during the Spanish-American War that still can be remembered by a lot today, is the charge of the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. Upon returning home after the war's end, only about 4 or 6 months later, Roosevelt would return home as one of the war's eminent heroes that had come out of the conflict, even though it was a very short conflict. And this is the picture of him and the Rough Riders on top of San Juan Hill in 1898 with the American flag hoisted on top. And right here in the middle would be Roosevelt. So that leads Roosevelt returning from the Spanish-American War kind of sets him on the path of what's going to eventually take him to the White House. And it's kind of funny because he wasn't even meant to get in there, technically. And we'll go through how that happens here as we look. So first, when Roosevelt comes back, the New York Republican political machine ends up throwing its support behind him to run for the Republican nomination for the 1898 New York gubernatorial election. New York's got to elect a new governor in 1898. Roosevelt ends up getting the Republican nomination, and he even ends up winning that election and becoming the governor of the state of New York. However, even though it had been a political party machine that had nominated him to the post and actually got him in, they expected that since you were nominated and brought in by the party, you will be expected to pay loyalty to the party and do whatever the big party bosses want you to do. Roosevelt was not that type of politician. He was very much an independent streak, independent-minded. He was not going to take orders from anybody else but the people. He wasn't going to take it from some political party boss. And that ended up kind of backfiring for these political Republican Party bosses within the party that kind of thought, oh yeah, Roosevelt would be perfect because we can boss him around. He's not that experienced. He's just had some service in the Civil Service Commission. He's had some in the State Assembly, but and maybe Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but it's nothing. He's never had a big cabinet position or anything like that, and he'd be easy to kind of boss around. And they rapidly find out that's not what's going to happen with Roosevelt. He's not that kind of politician, and they rapidly end up kind of regretting their choice to have him run for the governorship. So in 1900, New York Republican Thomas C. Platt would actually conspire with National Party boss Mark Hanna, who I mentioned in the McKinley video, had been a good friend of President William McKinley, was one of the main bosses nationally within the Republican Party at the time. And he conspires with party boss Mark Hanna to get Roosevelt named as McKinley's running mate, because McKinley's running for re-election in 1900, and in the previous year, in 1899, his first vice president, Garrett Hobart, I'm sorry, Garrett Hobart had actually ended up dying. He died, I believe it was November of 1899, and back then they couldn't just nominate a new vice president during the middle of their term to fill that place. The vice presidency would remain vacant until the next election cycle when the president chose a new running mate. So McKinley is in need of a new running mate going into his re-election year in 1900, and Platt is convincing Hanna, this guy ain't working out in New York the way we wanted him to. So is there any way that you might be able to pull some strings and get him to be nominated as McKinley's running mate? That way, if we can get him in the vice presidency, he won't be governor of New York anymore. He'll given that up. And at the same time, he won't be president because the vice president don't have that much power. He'll basically be in an important position, but at the same time, not hold real power. And he'll be nowhere that he can make any trouble within the big party bosses. That was the view of Platt. And it ended up working because Hanna did agree. And it was basically what they wanted to keep Roosevelt from running for a second gubernatorial term. So what better to do that than to lock him up in the vice presidency, an office that John Adams had said was one of the most inconsequential offices ever devised by the hand of man. And that was the idea going forward. Now, Roosevelt, upon being nominated as McKinley's running mate for his reelection, did go ahead and accept that nomination. And in the election of 1900, Roosevelt would campaign vigorously for McKinley. He would actually travel over 21,000 miles and spoke in over 24 states, probably traveling far more than almost any political candidate in history up to that point, which helped to secure the victory over Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who ran against McKinley for a second time after having first been defeated by him in 1896. On September 6th, well, before we get there, so Roosevelt ends up getting elected with McKinley, and now he's vice president. And the Republicans say, okay, this troublemaker, he's got an independent streak, yes, but he's also in a place that he's not going to be able to do any real political damage. Unfortunately, there were a few Republicans who kind of saw what could happen, almost forebodingly. They saw the possibility of, okay, what if something happens to McKinley? Then Roosevelt's president, isn't he? And they kind of brought that up. And they voiced to McKinley at one point saying, you do realize the only thing separating you from that cowboy is a bullet, right? And that is exactly what ends up happening, because on September 6th of 1901, McKinley ended up being shot by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York, and then he died about almost a week later on September 14th, which now means Roosevelt has ascended to the presidency, and he's now in a position of power that the Republican Party bosses did not want him in, and now he's calling the shots. He was only 42 when he took office, which makes him the youngest president in American history to have come into office. And in a December address to Congress, Roosevelt voiced his belief that government should mediate between conflicting forces in order to stabilize American society. He saw the government as an engine for change within society, and it was his full intention to use every bit of executive power that he had in order to enact that change that he saw that the government had every right to do. So that brings us to his presidency, and perhaps one of the most defining things of Roosevelt's presidency was what was coined later on. I don't know if Roosevelt himself ever called it this, but what we commonly call Roosevelt's square deal. Roosevelt would begin, it was his own domestic program while he was in office, and in it he promised to battle industrial trusts that had restrained American trade and hurt American consumers. Trusts had come about as basically a form of monopoly, where these giant trusts were formed out of multiple different companies that had owned certain industries entirely. So, like Standard Oil was run by John D. Rockefeller and owned almost all of the oil production in the United States. You had Carnegie Steel, which ran most of the American steel industry. You even had one for the railroads, which was the Northwestern Securities Company. And these trusts had really come about in the 1890s, and the idea was that it would keep these businesses in American hands. But at the same time, by eliminating competition, it formed massive monopolies that allowed these companies to charge whatever they wanted to their buyers, and there wasn't really much choice, because since they owned most of that certain industry in the United States, you didn't really have anyone else to go to, so you were kind of forced to accept whatever price they wanted. And Roosevelt saw that quite correctly as a breach of the American consumers' rights and a breach of a free market. This is supposed to be a free market economy. This is not a free market by having these monopolies. Something that really I think we ought to take into listen today, because we have the same problem going on now. Amazon, Disney, Facebook, Meta, I guess what it is now, and all of them, they're getting way too big. They need to be downsized. So there were big C's for the square deal, and there was 3 big C's. The first one was conservation of natural resources, corporate law, and consumer protection. So Roosevelt believed that trusts were the enemy of consumers. They were enemies of the American people, and as they allowed monopolies in trade, which would hurt consumers. Economic trusts, again, I'm going to argue otherwise. So Roosevelt began bringing trust-busting suits against the monopolies, and in some cases even went as far as the Supreme Court in order to get these suits to actually strike against these trusts and actually force them to basically break up. And he was successful in quite a few of these and made quite a few political enemies as well through the process. The first suit that he had brought was in 1902 against the Northern Securities Railroad Company, which had been formed by James J. Hill, E.H. Harriman, and J.P. Morgan. He also would sue Standard Oil and accomplish getting that one busted up as well. These were largely successful, much to the anger of conservatives within the Republican Party that did not like that Roosevelt was pretty much tampering with these. And as for constitutional authority, where Roosevelt said that he could do this, he argued the Constitution gives the president to enact executive powers, and at the same time, he took the view of, well, I don't see in the Constitution where it specifically says I can't do this, so I'm going to do it. And he also used the 1890 the Sherman Trust Act to kind of, he pretty much took that act, which was meant to kind of curb trusts, but it had never really been fully implemented. And Roosevelt implements it in a way that it has never been implemented before, and it's quite effective in his efforts to get these trusts broken up. Roosevelt would also intervene on behalf of coal mine workers in Pennsylvania in 1902, in that same year, where he would negotiate with the mine owners and coal strikers and actually managed to halt the strike while also gaining a pay increase for the miners. Roosevelt would also pursue efforts at conservation as part of his square deal of domestic policy. In June of 1902, he would sign the National Reclamation Act that would help establish large irrigation projects in the American West, which he had been out west. He saw the need to help American farmers get water to their crops, so this was something that he very much wanted. He would set aside over 200 million acres of undeveloped land for national forests, reserves, and wildlife refuges, which was over 5 times more than all of his predecessors combined. Unfortunately, in the process, Roosevelt was also more than willing to set aside former Native American tribal land into those allotments, and there were quite a few bits of Native American tribal land that were set aside into wildlife refuges or nature refuges and taken away from Native tribes. In 1904, Roosevelt would run for re-election with even the conservatives in his party, despite the fact that Roosevelt was proving to be more and more of a progressive candidate and wanting to fix social injustices that Americans have been complaining about for years, such as even food prices. And that was another thing that Roosevelt come up with, was he is partially responsible for the creation of the FDA, because during Roosevelt's presidency, there was a book that came out called The Jungle that really caught the American public's attention, including the president's, because it really detailed the American food making industry in the United States and what was going into food, how poorly sanitized and clean these food factories were, how dead animals and, dirt and all kinds of stuff was getting into the food, how they were shortcutting stuff and not putting the real things in there. And this appalled a lot of people, and it got a hold of Roosevelt's attention as well. And it ended up causing him to go along the lines of creating an agency that would eventually become the FDA. And the FDA, of course, kind of regulates food production within the United States. It kind of sets codes and guidelines as to what's acceptable and what can be properly packaged and actually sold to people as food. And if you're caught in violation, there are massive consequences with even jail time and large fines. So that was also something that would come from Roosevelt. In 1904, he ran for re-election, as we mentioned, with even the conservatives going with him. He would become the first president who had ascended to the presidency after the death of their predecessor to win in their own right. He got his own term, which none of the other ones before, not Andrew Johnson, not Chester Arthur, not Millard Fillmore, and not John Tyler. None of them had gotten their own term after inheriting their predecessor's term. Roosevelt did. He was the first one to do this, and perhaps one of the only few to do this. I believe the only other one that might have done it was Harry Truman and Lyndon B. Johnson. So the 1904 election results, it was a landslide victory for Roosevelt. There were 476 electoral votes with a total majority of 239 needed to win. Roosevelt would win 336 of those votes, while his Democratic opponent Alton Parker would win 140. The popular vote, it was 56.4% for Roosevelt and only 37.6% for Parker. And let me see here, this is a picture of the Electoral College map from the 1904 election. The result, it was pretty much a sweep for Roosevelt, except for the South, which was traditionally Democratic in those days. They didn't really vote for Republicans all that much often, but the rest of the country went for him. And then here we also have a picture of him driving as president through the Sequoia Tunnel in, I believe, Redwood Forest in California. This was him driving through the tunnel, one of the sequoia trees out there in California, which kind of led along with his conservation efforts. Here's a picture of Roosevelt and his family taken when they were in the White House. So we have Teddy right here, We have also their children. This oldest one in the back, this is Alice, which is his oldest daughter from his first marriage. She was kind of the rebel. She was even a public smoker at the time, which was not acceptable for women at the time. This is his wife, Edith. And then we have some of the boys as well. Archie and I don't know which was which year, but these two youngest one would be Archie and Quentin. You'd have Ted Jr., and then you would have Kermit up here, and then their other daughter that they had over here. But this was the whole family at that time, and they even had quite almost a zoo at the White House. It was astounding how many animals they had. So that leads us to his second term. So Roosevelt would focus heavily on foreign policy during the latter half of his first term and going into his second. He shared McKinley's belief in bringing the United States out of isolationism and becoming a global power. That in order for the United States to become a global power, it needed to accept the responsibility and duties that came with that prestige. And America should, and according to Roosevelt's belief, it should speak softly and carry a big stick when it came to foreign affairs and diplomacy. The president should be willing to use force in his view, and Latin America would be a major focus of his administration. In 1903, the United States had actually aided in Panama becoming independent from Colombia, and in order for the United States to buy rights from Panama in order to start constructing the Panama Canal, which Roosevelt would later regard as the hallmark of his presidency, the greatest accomplishment he ever accomplished while in office, which was started during his term. And Colombia had actually been unwilling to sell Panama, so that is why the United States ended up covertly backing the Panamanian rebels in order to overthrow Colombian rule so they could get this lucrative deal. Roosevelt would also issue a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine issued by former President James Monroe back all the way in 1823, almost 100 years before at that time. And the Roosevelt corollary was added to the Monroe Doctrine as saying that the United States would bar foreign intervention in Latin America and it would police the Western Hemisphere. It would also ensure that countries pay their debts so that they don't incur any forced payments from European nations who might try to invade them in order to force the payments. Roosevelt would win a Nobel Peace Prize in 1905 for his role in leading the negotiations between Russia and Japan in order to end the Russo-Japanese War, which resulted in the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed up in New Hampshire in order to end that war between them. He would also get Japan to recognize American control of the Philippines in exchange for trade negotiations. During his second term, Roosevelt would also rebuild the Navy, and he toured the world with the Great White Fleet in 1907, which all the ships had been painted bright white, and he went on and these ships sailed across the entire world. They would circumnavigate the whole world to display American naval power. Now, Congress did not fully agree with the concept of spending all this money and then parading it around the world. They did, especially the conservatives within his party. And Roosevelt kind of called them on a bluff that they ended up making. They pretty much made the statement that we're not going to pay for you to take this circumnavigation trip or halfway all around the world with our fleet. And Roosevelt said, fine, that's fine. So he ends up taking it halfway. And then he dares the Senate. He's like, okay, I know that bill's on the table. I'm all the way over here in Asia or Europe. It was one of the two. And he pretty much threatened them. He said, I know that bill's on the table to provide this more funding, so I dare you. Vote it down and leave the fleet here or pass it so they can sail home. And it kind of called the Congress's bluff, and they were forced to pass that funding bill just in order to get the fleet back home. It was kind of Roosevelt calling a bluff on Congress. As the election of 1908 would near, Roosevelt would grudgingly stick to an earlier campaign he had made in campaign promise in 1904 that he would not seek another term. Privately, Roosevelt very much wanted to seek another term, but he had already made the campaign promise 4 years earlier that he would not, and thus wanted to keep to his promise. What caused him to really want to seek another term was that he feared that the conservative Republicans within the party would end up undoing his accomplishments upon him leaving office. So he wanted to throw his support behind somebody who he believed would be a perfect person to still stand up to the conservatives within the party, as he was a progressive, and resist their calls to get rid of his agendas while at the same time still progressing and advancing what Roosevelt had begun. And he ended up settling on his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who really had wanted to actually become a judge on the Supreme Court and didn't have all that much interest in the presidency, but he was able to be goaded by Roosevelt into taking the nomination of the Republican Party in 1908 for the election. Taft would end up winning the 1908 election and would take office in March 4th, 1909, meaning that Roosevelt was now a former president. Upon leaving office, Roosevelt would embark on a 10-month African safari and a tour of Europe, in which he got even photos of him shooting an elephant, which we do have. He would also, however, for Roosevelt, when he returned home in 1910, he would find that Taft was not living up to the expectations that he had had. Taft had actually bowed to the conservative elite within the party, was actually siding with them on multiple occasions, and was actually starting to undo many of the things that Roosevelt had already passed, as well as he pretty much stopped altogether trying to advance other things that he had promised Roosevelt he would continue to fight for, more progressive reforms. So when he returns home in 1910, Roosevelt's not that happy with the way Taft has come. He views that Taft as a traitor. He's pretty much not doing what he promised me that he was going to do. And I'm very heavily now thinking about running again in 1912. Here we have a depiction of Roosevelt kind of coercing Panama to come out of Colombia in order for him to start building the Panama Canal back in about 1903. That's a political cartoon from the time that would illustrate that, how, the chicken's coming out of the egg that is Colombia in order to get the gift that he's offering in order to build that canal. And here we have a picture of an African elephant that Roosevelt actually shot while on his African safari in 1909, standing next to it. And then here we have a political cartoon. This is the last one we had, so I'm just showing it now, of what was going on in 1912, 1911, after Roosevelt returned back to the United States and learned that Taft was not doing what he wanted. These two became political enemies instead of friends. What ended up happening was Roosevelt started criticizing Taft, calling him, you're not doing what you promised me. You're not doing what you said you'd do. And it made them political enemies because Taft's trying to defend his record, while at the same time he's hurt that his friend is obviously calling him, a backstabber and a traitor and, dishonest man. Enraged at Taft, Roosevelt would challenge him for the Republican nomination in 1912. He would end up being snubbed by the conservatives within the party, who did not want a progressive candidate on top of the list again, and they kind of thought we had the last say. We've won. We denied him the nomination. Taft got the nomination despite him wanting it. There's nothing he can do. Roosevelt wasn't done yet. He decided that he was going to mount a third-party bid, an independent bid on his own, with the newly formed Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, which that nickname came from the fact that Roosevelt had once referred to himself as fit as a bull moose. And Roosevelt would actually end up being shot in October of 1912 while campaigning in Milwaukee. He was about to give a speech when someone had walked up to him and shot, pervertedly, because he had said the ghost of William McKinley had told him to shoot him, ironically, and the bullet had gone to Roosevelt's chest, but Roosevelt was able to correctly judge that the bullet was not life-threatening and proceeded to give his speech before actually going to the hospital. Here, come find out, what had saved Roosevelt's life was the bullet had barely pierced him, but what had saved his life was he had the folded-up copy of his speech in his pocket, in his breast pocket, and it was so thick it had slowed the bullet down enough that it had not seriously wounded him, which was quite astonishing. Roosevelt would end up losing the 1912 election, but so would Taft, because with the split among Republican voters over whether or not to go with the party's nominee or that of the old Republican Party nominee who they had loved so much, with the split amongst Republican voters, it allowed Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson to take the election in 1912 and gain the presidency. But Roosevelt's bid for a third-party bid would be come in second. Taft would actually be third, and Roosevelt, to this day, is the most successful third-party bid in history, in American history ever made. Roosevelt would remain attuned to politics after the 1912 election, where he was an early advocate for American entry into the First World War when that started in August of 1914. Of course, President Wilson decided to go with neutrality first, of which Roosevelt was a big critic of. He didn't really think the United States could stay out of Europe's war because he saw how interconnected it was. And eventually, when the United States finally got into the fight in World War I in 1917, all four of Roosevelt's sons would actually volunteer to go fight for the United States when World War I was officially declared. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, Quinton would end up being killed while on a flying mission over Germany. Roosevelt didn't live long after World War I. He unfortunately passed away of a pulmonary embolism, which was a blood clot in his lung. He died in his sleep on January 6th of 1919 at the family home in Oyster Bay, New York, where he was only age 60. And ironically, some of the two most important things from Roosevelt's death, I think, one came from his son. It came from Archie. Archie had telegraphed his siblings and said, "The old lion is dead," referring to their father that he had passed. And Woodrow Wilson's vice president at the time, Thomas R. Marshall, had actually made the comment that death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, because had he been awake, there would have been a fight. And I think that's very much true for the character of the man, that had this man been awake when death came to take him, I think there would have been a little bit of a fight between the two, figuratively. So it's quite of a fun comment. But yeah, that sums up, I think, just the brevity or a brief history biography of Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, our 26th president. So that is, I think, all we have for him. So yeah, definitely he deserves a spot, I think, in one of the more upper tier American presidents, even to this day, for mostly toward his effort toward working for the actual common people, unlike a lot of modern day politicians. So that concludes for this video. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, anything of that like or manner, be sure to put that in the comment section below, and I will try to go through them when I can. I do not know what next week's video is going to be exactly yet, but I do have some ideas. I just got to figure out where I want to do certain ones yet. So we'll figure that out. So until then, hopefully everyone has a good rest of their weekend, a good start to the week, and we'll see you all back here for the next video.